Have you ever loved someone so deeply, only to lose them before you had the words to say? So imagine spending decades building a life of control, success, and silence, only to have the past return in the form of a name you haven't spoken aloud in 20 years. That's what happened to Matthew Colton, a high-powered CEO who agreed to an arranged marriage not for love, but for legacy. What he didn't know, the woman he was about to marry, was Claire Bennett, his first love, the one who vanished without goodbye. Now picture this, you're Claire. You left everything behind, including the boy who once made you believe in forever. And now you're standing face to face with him, not as teenagers, but as strangers bound by business and memory. Would you walk away again or dare to begin where your hearts once broke? This is a story about choices between duty and desire, between silence and truth, and maybe, just maybe, about how time doesn't erase love. It waits for us to be ready. If this stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a name, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin the story. Autumn in New Haven had a quiet way of reminding people how fast time could pass. The air was crisp, the kind that stung a little when you inhaled too deeply. Leaves rustled down the cobblestone sidewalks, coating the world in shades of gold and rust, as though nature itself was in the middle of letting go. Matthew Colton stood in his office, 34 floors above the city, his hand wrapped around a lukewarm mug of black coffee. He hadn't taken a sip in the last hour. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows looked picturesque, the harbor in the distance, sailboats like scattered toothpicks on still water. But inside, a storm was brewing. At 38, Matthew had inherited Colton Group, a multi-generational company rooted in steel, shipping, and, more recently, green infrastructure. It had been his grandfather's pride, his father's burden, and now his impossible responsibility. The company was bleeding slowly, but unmistakably. A series of failed expansions, global disruptions, and investor pullouts had brought it to its knees. Behind him, the oak door clicked open, and his mother's voice, cool, controlled, entered before she did. "Matthew, we need to talk." Evelyn Colton walked in, as elegant as ever in her charcoal gray suit, pearls catching the morning light. Her silver blonde hair was twisted back in a low chignon, a look she'd maintained for as long as he could remember. "I thought we already did," Matthew replied without turning. "You want me to save the company by getting married, and I thought you might have slept on it and realized I'm not entirely wrong." He turned slowly, his tall frame taut with tension. "You want me to marry for business, Mother? Do you hear yourself?" "I do," she said calmly, settling into the leather armchair by the fireplace. "And I hear the board preparing to dismantle everything your grandfather built, everything your father sacrificed his life for." Matthew's jaw tightened. They never talked about his father's death directly. Heart attack at 58. He'd collapsed in the very room they were in, trying to broker a deal with foreign investors. The man had spent decades married more to the company than to Evelyn or his son. "I made a promise, Matthew," she continued, "to your father, that I would protect this company until you were ready. And now you are, but you can't do it alone." He crossed his arms. "So, your solution is for me to marry some woman I don't know, to impress a bunch of board members who think a single man can't lead the Whitmore Group is our last shot, she said evenly. Their chairman believes in traditional values, family, stability. They want to see a CEO who's settled. They need to trust you. A marriage, even if discreet, signals reliability. Matthew exhaled, the weight pressing deeper into his chest. You want me to perform love, like a role in a play? Have you forgotten what that cost you? Evelyn's eyes softened, a rare crack in her armor. I haven't. Your father and I did what we had to do. It was cold at times, but it worked. You were raised in a house without chaos, with legacy. That means something. Matthew. Legacy, he repeated, almost bitterly. What good is legacy if you lose your soul to protect it? Silence lingered between them. Then, with calm precision, Evelyn laid a dossier on the table. Her name is Claire Bennett. She's 36, director of the Wellspring Arts Foundation. Her late father was Harold Bennett, the one who started those after-school art programs in rural Connecticut. She's well-regarded, independent, and has everything they're looking for. Matthew blinked, his breath catching. Claire Bennett. The name slipped out like a whisper he hadn't expected. Evelyn noticed, You've heard of her. He didn't answer immediately. His mind was already traveling back in time to a quiet lakeside town called Waterford, to the soft scent of pine needles in summer, to a girl with paint-streaked fingers and eyes like worn denim. Callie, he used to call her. I knew her, he said finally, a long time ago. Then, that makes this easier, Evelyn said. No, he said, voice harder now. It makes it harder. That night. Matthew sat alone in his apartment. He turned on no lights. Only the dim glow of the city through his window gave shape to the shadows around him. He pulled out an old cigar box from the back of his closet. Inside, among concert tickets, a cracked compass, and a faded photograph of a 13-year-old boy holding hands with a girl in overalls, was a letter, unopened, return address smudged by time. He had written to Claire for 3 summers after she vanished. No reply ever came. She had disappeared without warning, without goodbye from his life, and he had buried that absence like a wound under layers of work, expectations, and the cold practicality of adulthood. But now she was back, or rather, she had never really left. Could he marry Claire Bennett? And, more hauntingly, could he pretend not to remember what she meant to him? Claire Bennett didn't believe in fate. At least, not the kind that showed up wearing pearls and proposing contracts. She sat at a small table inside Marlowe Cafe, the type of place where the light always looked soft and the chairs creaked just enough to feel lived in. Her tea had gone cold chamomile, always chamomile, but she hadn't touched it. Across from her sat Evelyn Colton, calm and unhurried, as if she were discussing the weather and not, in fact, asking Claire to marry her son. Claire blinked. You want me to do what it's not quite as shocking as it sounds, Evelyn said, folding her hands neatly over her purse. I'm asking if you'd consider a partnership, a temporary arrangement, a marriage in name, for the sake of appearance. Claire didn't speak for a long moment. She stared at the steamless tea, at the spoon resting too still beside it. Her breath felt shallow. This is ridiculous, she said finally, trying to laugh it off. You want me to pretend to be in love with a man I don't know for business. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. I never said love. This is about stability, about saving two institutions that matter. Claire leaned back in her chair. What do I get out of it, besides my name in the society pages? Evelyn slid a folder across the table. Funding. Enough to keep your foundation solvent for the next 10 years. Enough to expand into 3 new cities. You'd maintain full control. No strings except the one on your finger. Claire hesitated. Her fingers brushed the edge of the folder. Inside would be numbers salvation dressed in dollars and signatures. She didn't open it. I won't marry a stranger, she said quietly. Evelyn studied her, then spoke carefully. His name is Matthew. Matthew Colton. And just like that, the air in the room shifted. Claire froze. A memory flickered, slow and golden. A boy with messy hair, taller than the others, who used to sneak her sunflower seeds at recess. The boy who once painted her name into the bark of a tree with nothing but a pocket knife and a promise. Matthew Colton, Claire repeated, barely above a whisper. From Waterford, Evelyn's expression sharpened slightly. You knew each other. We were... She trailed off. What were they? Just kids. And yet, somehow more than that. I didn't know, Evelyn said, genuine surprise in her voice. That wasn't part of my plan. Claire stared out the window, heart thudding. When do you need an answer tomorrow? That evening, Claire sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by sketchbooks. Some were new, filled with lesson plans and doodles from the kids she taught. Others were old, weathered at the edges, carrying the dust of a different time. She opened one of the oldest, a spiral-bound notebook with her name scrawled across the front in faded marker. Inside, sketches of lakes, tree swings, and initials carved into wood. MC plum CB, inside a crooked heart. She hadn't thought about Matthew Colton in years. Not really. Not since her family left Waterford in the middle of a summer that had started like magic and ended like a silent storm. One day, he was her best friend. The next, he was a memory she wasn't allowed to write back to. She picked up her phone. Her aunt, the woman who had raised her, was always the voice of reason. He's the one from back then, Claire said as soon as the call connected. The one I told you about. Her aunt was quiet for a moment. Callie, do you still feel something for him? I don't know what I feel, Claire said, but I remember him, and that memory, it's warm. It doesn't feel fake. Then maybe it's worth exploring. Not for the money, not for the foundation, but for you. The next morning, Claire met Evelyn again, this time in the Colton Group's downtown office. It smelled like polished wood and restrained ambition. I'll do it, Claire said, but on one condition. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Which is, I want to meet him first, in private. Before anything is signed, I want to know if we can even stand being in the same room. Evelyn's face relaxed into something close to a smile. That's fair. I'll arrange it. Later that afternoon, Evelyn made a call. He agreed to meet. She said, her voice measured. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. I've reserved a quiet booth at Addison's Cafe. You'll have privacy. Matthew, on the other end of the line, said nothing for a beat. When he did speak, his voice was low. Claire Bennett, he murmured. It really is her yes, and, from the look on her face, she remembered you too. Evelyn hesitated. Matthew, she said softly. I didn't know when I chose her, but maybe this is something more than business." He looked down at the old photo still resting on his desk. Two kids, barefoot and sunburnt, laughing near a lake. A time when life felt simple, before legacies, before expectations. "I'll be there," he said. The old studio on Cedar Street always smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender. Claire Bennett loved that about it. The scent had seeped into the wooden floors and high-beamed ceiling, as much a part of the place as the mismatched easels and chipped coffee mugs. It was here, among dusty windows and second-hand brushes, that Claire had spent the last 10 years trying to make something good out of what her father left behind. The Wellspring Arts Foundation was never glamorous. They didn't host galas or name buildings after donors. Instead, they gave children crayons, canvases, and a place to breathe when the world around them didn't. Claire had seen it happen again and again, how a simple brushstroke could bring quiet to a noisy life. But now, even that was in jeopardy. The numbers were clear in 6 months. They'd have to shut down 2 of their 3 locations. The after-school programs would end. The summer camps wouldn't return. The nonprofit world was brutal in its own way. Soft work built on brittle funding, and Claire had run out of things to sell or repurpose. That's when Evelyn Colton walked into her life. And now, Claire stood in front of a blank canvas, brush in hand, heart heavy with doubt. The marriage proposal, if one could even call it that, sounded absurd on paper. A temporary union, a performance, a partnership in name, not in affection. And yet, it came with the promise of financial security for her foundation. 10 years of funding, no board interference, no strings. Evelyn had said, but Claire knew better. There were always strings. What twisted her thoughts into knots wasn't the proposal itself, but the man behind it, Matthew Colton, or, as she once called him, Jamie. She hadn't heard that name out loud in more than 2 decades. But the moment Evelyn said Matthew Colton, a door in her memory had creaked open. She remembered the way he used to toss pebbles at her window, the way his laugh made everything feel lighter. The last summer in Waterford, the secret treehouse, the promise he whispered before she disappeared from his life. "Callie, you can always find me. Just follow the lake." But she never did, because life hadn't given her the choice. The year Claire turned 14, her world collapsed. Her father, Harold Bennett, had taken out loans, tried to expand the foundation too quickly, and lost everything. The shame of financial ruin was one thing, but the night he took his own life was something else entirely. Claire and her mother packed their lives into a U-Haul and left Waterford before sunrise. No goodbyes, no explanations, just silence. She had written to Matthew, once, maybe twice. But what do you say after something like that? How do you tell the boy who kissed you behind a boathouse that your father is gone and nothing feels safe anymore? So she didn't. And now, 2 decades later, she was being asked to sit across from him, not as Claire the girl who vanished, but Claire the woman who needed his last name to keep a dream alive. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her aunt, the woman who'd stepped in when her mother had fallen into a fog of grief. "Aunt Lydia, you don't have to do this. Callie, money isn't everything." Claire replied quickly, "Claire, I know. But the kids, they're everything. She stared at the message, thumb hovering before adding one more line. And he's not a stranger. The next morning, Claire sat with her board of directors, a group of teachers, artists, and quiet believers who had stood by her through years of ramen budgets and makeshift fundraisers. "I've been presented with an option," she began. "It's unconventional and deeply personal, but it could save the foundation." They listened as she explained the proposal, omitting the name, keeping it professional, and when she finished, there was silence. Then Luis Alvarez, their program coordinator and Claire's closest friend at the foundation, leaned forward. "Do you trust him? I used to," she said softly. Luis studied her. "And now I don't know, but I trust what we've built here. I trust that it deserves to survive." He nodded slowly. "Then do what you have to do. We've got your back." That evening, Claire stood in front of her mirror, hair pulled loosely back, no makeup, just herself. The girl in Waterford had believed in first kisses and promises under stars. This woman had learned that not all stories ended sweetly. But maybe, just maybe, some didn't end at all. They just paused. And if this meeting with Matthew was a new chapter, she would walk into it with open eyes and steady hands. Because if she was going to walk back into the life of the boy she once loved, she needed to do it not as someone asking for rescue, but as someone who had survived. The cafe on Addison Avenue was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, just as Evelyn had promised. A soft hush blanketed the place, broken only by the occasional hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle clink of ceramic cups against saucers. Matthew Colton had arrived early. He always did, not out of punctuality, but control. If he arrived first, he didn't have to brace for surprise. He could study the room, find the best angle, prepare for discomfort before it arrived. But today, even the dim lighting and quiet background music couldn't steady the churn in his chest. He sat in a corner booth, black coffee untouched in front of him, hands resting on the table like he didn't trust them in his lap. He hadn't seen Claire Bennett in over 20 years. He had imagined this moment more times than he could count, in dreams that ended with laughter, in nightmares that ended with silence. But now that she was actually coming, none of those fantasies fit. He wasn't the boy she once knew, and she wasn't the girl he had lost. The bell above the door rang. Matthew looked up, his breath catching halfway. Claire stood just inside the entrance, framed by the fading afternoon light. She wore a navy dress, simple and unassuming, and carried a worn leather bag slung over one shoulder. Her hair, still that familiar chestnut brown, was pulled back in a loose knot, a few strands escaping around her temples. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Same eyes, same shade of storm-washed blue. Only now they held something deeper, something quieter and more knowing. They stared at each other, motionless. Claire blinked first. She walked toward him slowly, her steps hesitant, like approaching an edge she wasn't sure would hold. "Hi," she said softly, stopping just short of the booth. Matthew stood, his throat dry. "Hi." They sat. Silence settled between them, like an old friend, awkward, familiar, impossible to ignore. Claire took a breath. "This is surreal." Matthew nodded. "Yeah, it is." More silence. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," she added, voice quieter now, "I never forgot you," he replied. Claire looked down at her hands. "I didn't know you'd become this." She gestured vaguely his tailored suit, the corner office life he clearly carried. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't know you'd disappear." Her eyes flicked up, sharp, wounded. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I know," he replied after a pause. "I just wish I had known something, anything." She exhaled, long and slow. "Me too." They sat for several minutes, the silence between them thick with memories neither had asked for. Finally, Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a sketch pad. She slid it across the table. Matthew opened it. Inside was a pencil drawing, simple, rough, but unmistakable. A treehouse. Their treehouse. The one they built from scrap wood and teenage pride, hidden behind the Bennett's old barn in Waterford. He traced the lines gently. "You kept this. I drew it a week after I left," she said. "It's the only version that stayed with me." He looked at her, something unspoken tightening in his chest. "You didn't send it." "No," she whispered. "I didn't send a lot of things." They talked then slowly, cautiously, like two people learning how to speak again. They skipped the surface-level chatter, diving into old summers, favorite places, the dog they tried to rescue from the lake one rainy afternoon. Claire smiled more than she expected. Matthew laughed once, unexpectedly, when she reminded him how he used to be afraid of frogs. But the lightness faded when the conversation returned to the present. "So," Claire said, folding her hands in front of her, "about this arrangement?" Matthew nodded, back straightening. "Yes, I need this," she admitted, "for the foundation, for the kids, but I won't do it if we can't be civil." "We can be civil," he said, "and honest." He hesitated. "Claire Callie, this isn't how I imagined seeing you again." She gave a sad smile. "You imagined it. Too often," he confessed, "but never like this." She paused, then said gently, "We can't change what brought us here, but maybe we can decide what comes next." They agreed to proceed cautiously. 6 months, a public marriage, appearances kept, lives respected, no expectations, no interference, just time. When they stood to leave, Claire hesitated. "There's one more thing," she said. "If we do this, I don't want to pretend." Matthew furrowed his brow. "What do you mean I don't want fake smiles or rehearsed stories? If people ask, we can say it started as business. But if there's going to be anything real about this, even just mutual respect, it has to be real from the start." He nodded slowly, agreed. They stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the last light of day melting into the horizon. Matthew looked over at her. "Do you still go by Callie?" Claire shook her head. "Not in years. I like that name," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe you'll earn it back." The gala was understated by Colton standards. No towering champagne fountains, no endless strings of executives in tuxedos murmuring about quarterly margins. Instead, the hall inside the Westbridge Cultural Center had been dressed in soft lights, simple floral arrangements, and displays of children's art along the walls. Claire Bennett had insisted on that part. "If this partnership is real," she had told Evelyn Colton weeks earlier, "then we don't start by parading power. We start by showing what we care about." Evelyn had raised a brow but hadn't objected. "Now!" Claire stood near one of the display tables. adjusting a crooked frame showing a finger-paint landscape of a city skyline. The artist was 8. His name was Darren. He had never seen a real skyscraper. "You used to draw like that," a voice said softly behind her. She turned. Matthew Colton stood there, hands tucked in his pockets, tie slightly loosened, a small rebellion against the formality of the evening. His gaze was on the drawing. "I did not," Claire said, a smile tugging despite herself. "Mine had more horses and spaceships." She laughed, caught off guard. "Okay, maybe that's true." He looked at her, then really looked, not the way a business partner might, or even an old friend, but like someone trying to see through time. "You remember," she said, voice quieter now. "More than I probably should," he admitted, "especially these past few weeks." Claire turned back to the drawing. "I do too." Later that evening, during a quiet moment between speeches and toasts, Claire wandered outside to the terrace. The sky was thick with stars, the kind of clear black that only appeared in October when the air turned sharper. She stood by the railing, hugging her shawl close, and let the cold bite her arms a little. A small punishment, maybe, or just a way to feel more awake. Cold Matthew's voice behind her again. She didn't turn, a bit, but it helps me think. He joined her, standing at just enough distance not to crowd her. Below them, the city hummed. Nothing loud, just the low and constant thrum of life carrying on. "Do you remember the lake?" she asked suddenly. "Waterford?" "Of course. There was this one night," she said, eyes still on the sky. "Late July. We stayed out too long, and the fireflies came out. My mom was furious. She thought we'd run off." "You fell in the water trying to catch one." "I ruined my sneakers," he said with a chuckle. "And you cried," Claire added with a sideways glance. He feigned offense. "I absolutely did not." "You did, quietly, because they were your favorite." They laughed, the sound soft and full of something that tasted like youth. Then the silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. "I kept some of your letters," Claire said after a moment. "The ones I never answered." He turned his head slowly. "You did?" "They were hidden in the back of my closet, inside a shoebox I pretended didn't exist. Why didn't you write back?" She hesitated, "Because I didn't know what to say. That wouldn't break your heart," she said honestly. "Because I didn't have any good answers. And because I thought I'd ruined everything." He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the city lights. Then, finally, "You didn't ruin anything." Claire blinked. "You were just a kid, Callie," he said gently. "And so was I. Life happened. It's not your fault." The nickname Callie wrapped around her like a long-lost sweater. "I haven't been that girl in a long time," she whispered. "I know," Matthew said, "but she's still there, in your laugh, in the way you look up when you're thinking. She's not gone. Inside." The crowd shifted. A woman from the Board of Cultural Development approached them later with a bright smile and a question loaded with social grace. "So?" she asked. "How did you two meet?" Matthew and Claire exchanged a glance. Claire opened her mouth, then paused. Matthew stepped in, smiling. "We met at summer camp," he said. "She taught me how to build a treehouse. I taught her how to sneak Oreos without getting caught." Claire grinned. "He still owes me a whole pack." The woman laughed politely, then drifted away. Claire turned to him. You didn't lie. No, he said, I just told the part that matters. As the evening wound down, they stood near the entrance, sending off guests and accepting congratulations. The event had been a success, more donations pledged, more eyes opened to what Wellspring was doing. But the real shift wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way Claire caught herself watching Matthew as he spoke to an elderly donor, the way he listened intently, nodded slowly, made her feel seen. It was in the moment he reached for her hand to guide her through a group photo, his touch lingering just slightly longer than necessary. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it wasn't pretend anymore, either. The rain came suddenly, a heavy, sideways storm that painted the city in streaks of gray and reflection. Claire Bennett stood in the foyer of the Colton Group's headquarters, her umbrella soaked and dripping a steady rhythm onto the tile floor. The gala had ended 2 nights ago, and since then, everything between her and Matthew had felt tentative. Warmer? Yes, but also fragile, like glass warmed by sunlight. Beautiful, yet close to breaking. She was there to meet him, not for a photo shoot, not for an event, just to talk. Something had been pulling at her since the gala, and she needed answers. Honest ones. When she reached the executive floor, Matthew's assistant nodded silently and opened the door to his private office. Matthew stood by the window, back turned, phone in hand. "I'll call you back," he said quickly, and hung up. "Claire," he greeted, turning toward her. "You're early." "So are you," she replied, setting her bag down. The air between them was oddly charged, too quiet, too full, like the city outside. Something was building, and Claire, for all her practiced calm, didn't want to be the one to set it off, but the words came anyway. "I need to ask you something." He nodded, signaling her to sit, but she remained standing. "Why me?" she asked. "Really? Why this arrangement, this partnership with me of all people?" Matthew's brow furrowed. "I told you the board needed to see stability." Evelyn thought, no. She interrupted. "Not your mother. You? Why did you agree to this? You could have married anyone for show. There are a dozen socialites who'd have said yes for a photo spread and a check." He took a step closer. "You think I chose you for convenience? I think you chose me because it felt safe," she snapped. "Because I'm the girl who left you, and you've been waiting 20 years to punish me for it." Matthew flinched like she'd struck him. Claire's voice wavered. "I've been wondering this since the day Evelyn said your name. Whether this was about business or revenge, silence, the kind that bruises." Matthew looked away. "No," he said finally, voice low. "It wasn't revenge." "Then what was it?" He hesitated. "It was unfinished." Claire's breath caught. "I don't know how to explain it." Matthew continued. "You were the beginning of something I never got to finish. When Evelyn suggested a marriage for optics, I thought it was insane until she said your name, and suddenly it didn't feel like performance. It felt like fate asking for a second chance." Claire swallowed hard. "You didn't think maybe I deserved a choice," in that Matthew's eyes darkened. "You think I forced you?" "No," she said, "but I think you knew it would corner me. You knew I wouldn't say no if the foundation depended on it." Now it was Matthew's turn to step back. He looked hurt and angry, and something else, something brittle. "I'm sorry," he said, voice clipped. "I thought maybe this could become something real, But maybe that was my mistake. Claire's voice cracked. I never asked for real. I asked for respect. I gave you that, he shouted, louder than he meant to. Outside, thunder rolled like a warning. Claire's eyes shone, but no tears fell. You gave me what you thought I needed, she whispered. You always have. A pause. Then she picked up her bag. I need air, she said. He didn't stop her. An hour later, Matthew stood alone in the old lakeside house his family still owned in Waterford. It was mostly unused now, just a dusty shell of their past summer memories clinging to the floorboards and faded wallpaper like ghost light. He needed distance, noise, anything but silence. But silence was all he had. He walked into the den, where an old wooden chest sat beneath a window that looked out over the lake. Inside, he found the letters, all of them, dozens, written to Claire after she left, unsent, unread, unopened. One, on the very top, caught his eye. The ink had smudged from the rain that came through a cracked window the summer he stopped writing. If you ever come back, I hope I still recognize you. I hope you still remember the way the lake sounded at night. He set the letter down and rubbed his face. Maybe I don't recognize you anymore either, he said quietly to no one. Back in the city, Claire sat in her apartment, surrounded by open sketchbooks. Her phone vibrated once, a text from Luis. Luis, did you talk to him? She stared at the screen. Claire, yeah, it didn't go well. Luis, sometimes it has to break before it can mean anything. She didn't respond, but her hands moved to her lap, to the pencil beside her, and began sketching. A boy at a window, a girl with a suitcase, rain between them. The morning after the storm, the city was washed clean. Sidewalks glistened, windows shone brighter, and everything felt like it had just been rinsed of something heavy. But inside Claire Bennett's apartment, the storm had simply moved indoors. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by old notebooks, loose papers, and a scattering of photographs she hadn't looked at in years. One photo sat on top, Matthew, age 13, with a crooked grin and messy hair, holding a stick like a sword. She was next to him, laughing, her eyes half closed in sunlight. A piece of her heart ached at the memory. She had spoken too harshly the day before, said things she meant, but in ways that bruised instead of healed. She'd accused Matthew of manipulation, of holding power over her, when deep down, what scared her most was how much he still mattered. She picked up the sketch pad she'd started after the gala and flipped to the back. Tucked inside was something she hadn't touched in 2 decades, a letter she wrote at 16, but never sent. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink faded in places, but the words still carried the weight of a younger self trying to speak through silence. Dear Jamie, it began. No Matthew, just Jamie, the boy who used to collect lake stones and hum badly to Beatles songs. I wish I could explain why I left the way I did, but I didn't understand it myself. Not back then. I just knew everything hurt. My dad was gone. My mom wasn't really there, and nothing felt safe anymore. I couldn't hold on to you and survive what was happening at home. So I let go. I let go of us. I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye. But it wasn't because you didn't matter. It was because you did. Claire swallowed hard. She pressed the letter flat and tucked it into a clean envelope. No address, just a name. That afternoon, she walked through the heart of the city to the Colton building, holding the envelope like it might disappear if she wasn't careful. She didn't plan to see Matthew, not yet, but she needed to leave this needed to give voice to the 16-year-old inside her who never had the chance to say anything at all. The receptionist gave a slight nod as Claire entered. "He's not in right now," she said softly, recognizing her. "That's okay," Claire replied. "Could you give him this?" She placed the envelope on the desk, her fingers lingering on it a moment longer than necessary. The receptionist gave a kind smile. "I will." 3 hours later, Matthew walked into his office, exhausted. He'd spent the day at a construction site on the company's green energy project, mud on his boots, questions in his ears, noise everywhere but inside. Inside, he felt nothing, or maybe too much. He saw the envelope on his desk. No return address, just his name, written in handwriting he knew before he even opened it. He sat down and read. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking. He set the letter down gently, then leaned back, closing his eyes. The words weren't perfect. They were raw, incomplete, but they were real. They explained everything: the silence, the sudden departure, the weight Claire had carried all these years without ever asking for his forgiveness. He didn't feel anger, he felt grief for the time they lost, for the girl who had to leave, for the boy who had waited. The next morning, Claire found a note taped to her apartment door. It was short, handwritten in Matthew's slanted script. "Meet me at Waterford, tomorrow, noon, if you're ready." Her heart beat so loudly it echoed in her ribs. She arrived the next day just before noon. The lake looked the same, impossibly still, ringed with early autumn leaves turning amber. The dock creaked beneath her steps, just as it had all those years ago. Matthew was already there, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out over the water. She approached slowly. "You got my letter," she said. He nodded, still staring ahead. "I read it 3 times. Silence. Then he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Why now?" "Because I finally had the words," she said. "And you couldn't say them in person. I was scared you wouldn't want to hear them," she admitted. Matthew looked down, picked up a small flat stone. "Skipped it once across the lake. She died 2 years ago," he said suddenly. Claire blinked. "Who, my mom?" he said quietly. "The woman I called Mom, not Evelyn, my birth mother. I only met her twice before she passed." Claire stepped closer. "I didn't know. I didn't either, for most of my life. Evelyn raised me like her own, but I always felt out of place. And then I met you." He glanced at her, and, for a little while, "I didn't." Claire's breath caught. "I held on to that," he continued, "long after you left, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know who I was without that piece of us." He looked at her then. "And now I think I'm finally ready to find out." Claire smiled. It was small, careful, but honest. So am I. The chapel by the lake wasn't grand. Its white paint was chipped in places, and the old wooden pews creaked with even the gentlest shift of weight. But sunlight streamed through its stained glass windows in soft, dappled colors, and the scent of pine drifted in from the trees just outside. It was perfect. Claire Bennett stood at the back of the aisle, a simple bouquet of wildflowers in her hand. No veil, no long train, just a soft ivory dress that swayed as she breathed. Outside, Only a dozen or so guests gathered: Luis from the foundation, a few board members from the Colton group, Evelyn in a powder blue dress that seemed almost too delicate for a woman so strong, and a few people from Waterford faces that had aged kindly since she'd last seen them. Claire's heart beat steady now, not nervous. Ready. Matthew Colton stood at the altar, hands folded in front of him, his charcoal suit crisp but unfussy, his hair, always slightly unruly, no matter how he combed it, caught the sunlight like soft threads of gold. He turned when the chapel doors opened, and for a moment, a single, suspended moment, time bent around them. Claire stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on his. No music, no dramatic gasp, just quiet understanding. She reached the front, and he took her hand. "You look like summer," he whispered, "and you look like someone who's finally slept." She replied. They both smiled. The ceremony was short. There were no elaborate readings or extravagant vows. Just two people, finally saying what they needed to say out loud, in front of others, and most importantly, to each other. The officiant began with a simple prompt. "Do you wish to speak your own vows?" Matthew nodded. "I do?" He turned to Claire. "I never expected to find you again. I certainly didn't expect to build a life with you this way. But here we are, not because of contracts or legacy, but because something in me always knew we hadn't finished our story. I don't promise perfection, but I do promise honesty. I promise to stand beside you, even when it's messy, especially then." Claire blinked back tears. "I didn't believe in second chances," she said, voice soft but unwavering. "For a long time, I thought the best things in life had a window, and once it closed, that was it. But you reminded me that some stories don't end. They wait, and when we're ready, they begin again. I can't promise I won't be afraid, but I can promise I won't walk away." The officiant smiled. "With the power vested in me and with a great deal of hope, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Matthew leaned in gently, carefully, and kissed her, not with urgency, but with reverence. The kiss was soft, the moment sacred. Later, during the small reception held outside under string lights, Claire found herself sitting alone at a table, watching Matthew speak with Luis. They were laughing about something, maybe the honeymoon destination he hadn't yet told her about. She sipped sparkling water, content. Then Evelyn appeared beside her. "He looks lighter," Evelyn said, watching her son. Claire smiled. "So do you." The older woman chuckled. "I was afraid. You know, when I brought your name to the table, I didn't realize what I was touching, or who I was bringing back. You couldn't have known." "Maybe not," Evelyn admitted, "but I'm glad I did." There was a pause. Then Evelyn added, "I think your father would be proud of you." Claire's eyes shimmered. "I hope so. I think about him a lot lately." Evelyn nodded. "I think he would have liked Matthew, too." Claire looked at her husband, now chasing after a cupcake dropped by one of the children from her art program. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think he would have." Later that night, after the last lantern had gone out and the last guest had left, Claire and Matthew walked barefoot down to the dock. The moon hung low and golden. Claire held her dress up just enough to keep the hem from getting wet. "I can't believe we did it," she said. "I can," Matthew replied, "because this time we didn't let fear decide." They sat at the edge of the dock, their feet dangling above the dark water. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. "I feel like I've come home," she whispered. "You have," he said. "So have I." The apartment on Monroe Street wasn't large, but it had a corner window that poured morning light into the kitchen and a tiny balcony just big enough for 2 chairs and a pot of lavender. Claire Bennett loved that lavender. She watered it every other day, trimming the stems just enough to keep it wild and soft. Sometimes, when Matthew Colton came home late, he'd find her out there barefoot, hair tied up, a sketchbook on her lap, and a pencil smudged between her fingers. They'd been married 3 weeks, and already it was less about vows and more about coffee filters, laundry, and learning when to speak and when to be still. One morning, Claire stood in front of the fridge, holding a half-full carton of milk. "Smell this," she said, wrinkling her nose. Matthew walked over, sniffed it, winced. "That's a no. You sure you've eaten things way worse?" "That's true," he said. "But I was in college, and the bar was lower." She smiled. "So, no cereal today. French toast, deal." They moved around the kitchen like people who had known each other longer than they had passing plates, bumping shoulders, laughing when the egg splattered onto the counter. Matthew cooked, Claire plated, and the silence between them wasn't silence anymore. It was rhythm. Some days were harder. They fought about things that didn't matter until they did her long hours at the foundation, his late-night emails to board members. One night, they argued about which wall the bookshelf should go on, and Claire burst into tears mid-sentence. Matthew froze. "Claire, it's just a shelf." She shook her head. "It's not. It's everything. It's this tiny thing that makes me feel like maybe we're not really building a life. We're just sharing space." He stepped back. "I didn't know you felt that way." She wiped her eyes. "Sometimes I don't, but sometimes I do." They stood in the mess of books and brackets, the room suddenly too quiet. Then Matthew reached out and pulled her close. "Okay," he said. "Then let's build something better. Together, not just rooms. Claire, a home." She didn't say anything, just nodded against his shoulder. And when they mounted the shelf that night together, it felt like more than furniture. It felt like healing. Claire started painting again. Really painting, not just quick demos for the kids or mock-ups for program proposals. She set up a corner in their second bedroom, filled it with canvases, soft music, and a tiny stool she used to sit on as a teenager. Matthew would sometimes stand in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching her work. Not intruding, just witnessing. One night, he found her asleep on the floor, curled next to a canvas that wasn't finished yet. It was a landscape, Waterford, the dock, the treehouse in the distance. She had painted it from memory, but this time there were 2 figures standing at the edge of the lake, side by side. He didn't wake her, just knelt down, brushed her hair gently from her forehead, and whispered, "You came back," 6 weeks into their marriage. Matthew invited Claire to a Colton Group board meeting. "You don't have to speak," he said. "Just sit beside me. Let them see the woman who made me better." Claire blinked. "Is that how you see me?" He smiled. "That's how I feel." So she went in a simple navy blouse, with her hair tied back and a notebook in her lap. She didn't speak, but she listened, nodded, and when one of the older board members raised a snide comment about her public image. Matthew shut it down with a look that spoke louder than words. Afterward, Claire squeezed his hand in the elevator. "Thanks," she said. He kissed her forehead. "Any time." Their routine settled into something steady. Mornings with coffee and quiet, afternoons in their separate worlds, his of meetings and numbers, hers of children and colors, evenings with mismatched dinners, old movies, and sometimes silence the good kind, and every week, without fail, they spent Sundays walking in the park, hand in hand, like no one else existed. On one of those walks, Claire said softly, "Do you think we would have found each other again if Evelyn hadn't arranged all this?" Matthew didn't answer right away. "Then I think we would have wanted to, but maybe we needed a little help." Claire nodded. "Yeah, maybe." Then she looked at him, eyes soft and sure. "I'm glad it was you." 6 months had passed since the wedding by the lake. Winter had come and gone, leaving behind wet sidewalks and tulips struggling to bloom along Monroe Street. Inside the apartment, morning light spilled across the hardwood floor where Claire Bennett sat, cross-legged, sorting through letters and photographs in preparation for a small exhibition hosted by her foundation. Matthew Colton walked in, still in pajama pants, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You're up early," he said, handing her one. She smiled. "It's the spring showcase next week. I thought I'd finally go through the old stuff." He nodded, sitting beside her. One photo caught his eye, a snapshot from their wedding day. Slightly tilted, slightly blurry, but perfect. Claire's head was thrown back mid-laugh, and Matthew's hand was at the small of her back. They looked unposed, unburdened. "I love that one," he said. "Me too," she whispered. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee, letting the quiet become part of the moment. The foundation had grown. Claire's programs now served 5 neighborhoods. Matthew had helped secure corporate sponsorships without ever once overstepping. He became a silent donor, a board member who listened more than he spoke. When Claire gave him a small art piece made by one of her students, a colorful abstract interpretation of strength, he framed it and placed it in his office, next to a photograph of the Waterford Lake. It had become clear to everyone who knew them, they weren't just working, they were building, not just a marriage, but a legacy. One evening, after a small dinner party they hosted for Claire's staff, Matthew found himself alone in the kitchen, rinsing wine glasses. Claire walked in, barefoot, hair undone, cheeks still flushed from laughter. "I got asked a weird question tonight," she said, hopping onto the counter. "Oh, Maria, one of our volunteers. She asked if I ever felt like our marriage started too late." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" Claire shrugged. "I said, maybe it started exactly when it was supposed to." He smiled, drying his hands. "You believe that I do now?" She reached for his hand, pulled him closer. "We weren't ready before," she said. "Not for this, not for the hard parts." Matthew leaned in, forehead touching hers. "But we are now." She nodded. "Every day." That summer, they returned to Waterford, not for nostalgia, but for grounding. They stayed in the old house by the lake, now renovated, but still echoing with childhood. Claire brought her sketchbooks. Matthew brought a fishing rod he hadn't used in years. They walked through town, ate at the same diner, sat under the same oak tree where they'd once carved their initials. One afternoon, they hosted a picnic for some of Claire's students and their families. A little boy named Noah tugged at Matthew's sleeve. "Are you married to Miss Claire?" Matthew grinned. "I am." Noah tilted his head. Why, Matthew looked at Claire, who was helping a girl open a juice box. "Because she makes everything feel like home," he said. The boy nodded solemnly, like that made perfect sense. As their first anniversary approached, Claire and Matthew planned a small celebration, just the two of them. No big event, no speeches, just dinner, a walk, and one promise renewed. But before they left the apartment that evening, Evelyn stopped by. She handed them a small wrapped box, her eyes brighter than usual. "Open it later," she said, "after dessert." Matthew kissed her cheek. Claire hugged her tightly. They never asked what was inside. That night, after dessert, and dancing in their living room to a Frank Sinatra record, they sat by the window and opened the box. Inside was a photograph, one neither of them had ever seen. It was from the summer they were 13. Claire and Matthew stood side by side at the Waterford Town Fair, holding cotton candy, grinning. Behind them, in the corner of the frame, stood Evelyn watching them, smiling gently. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. "Some stories begin long before we realize they've started. I saw the way you looked at each other then. I knew something rare had found you both. It just needed time. Thank you for not giving up on it. E." Claire pressed a hand to her chest. Matthew folded the note and placed it inside his wallet. "I guess she always knew," Claire said softly. "She saw what we couldn't," Matthew replied. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad we learned to see it, too." The next day, Claire gave a speech at the Foundation's Expansion Gala. She stood in front of donors, families, artists, people who believed in second chances, in healing, in hope. She told them the story of Wellspring's beginning, of Harold Bennett and his dreams, of art classes in tiny rooms, of a girl who left home and came back with more than she lost. She didn't talk about the arranged marriage or the business deal or the doubts. She talked about growth, and about the boy who once found her crying by a lake and said, "I'll wait right here until you're ready." The crowd rose to its feet when she finished, but all she saw was Matthew, standing near the back, hands in his pockets, heart in his eyes, waiting. Still, life rarely gives us second chances, but when it does, will we be brave enough to take them through Matthew and Claire's journey? We are reminded that time doesn't always heal what is left unsaid. Sometimes healing begins only when we dare to return not to the past, but to the truth we once buried. Their story teaches us that love, when rooted in honesty and grace, can bloom again, even after years of silence. Many of us carry unfinished stories, a goodbye never said, a letter never sent, a memory that still stings. But it's never too late to make peace, not just with others, but with ourselves. Like Claire and Matthew, we can choose to soften, to speak, to stay. This story is not just about love. It's about courage, forgiveness, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. So, if you've ever wondered whether the heart can heal at any age, let this be your gentle reminder. It can. And it's never too late to come home. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, made you remember something or someone you once loved, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel. Every story we tell is made with care and with you in mind. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and keep listening.